Evening, everyone. Um, Thank you all for coming and call to order. Our first thing on the agenda is approval of the agenda for this evening. Put it to the floor for first. Thank you, Lucille. And a second. Diane, all in favor? Everyone? Thank you. That's done. Minutes for May 7th. Again, put to the floor. Thank you, Lisa. Second. Margot, all in favor? Everyone? Thank you. That's done. We'll move on to action for this evening, the long-awaited budget. Mark will be speaking to that on the budget discussion on 2.1 this evening, so I'll give the floor to Mark.
Thanks, Danielle. So here we are. After much delay, we finally have a draft budget, and I'll flip this to presentation mode. Sorry, this is different than I'm used to seeing here in Acrobat. How do I do this? I gotta sign in to do this? No.
If you go to view.
That's not right. Go to view up here.
No, when you were back in the slideshow.
I am in slideshow. This thing right here? Oh, I just got rid of all that. Sorry, folks. There we go. Sorry about that. So we finally have, I'll say, most of the budget from the province, because even then we don't have everything. There are some of our specific grants that we don't have, but the vast bulk of it, the technical paper for the GSN, the Grant for Student Needs, it came 2 Fridays ago. So we're glad to have that. I think I've said to you before, this is 2 months late. So it's been quite the scramble for us. We've been working on planning what as best we could, anticipating what we thought the money would be, but we just got the detail, just over a week ago. So what you've seen in you saw the basic premise of the budget and how it's all structured and where we spend all that when Roxana Nagoy, our superintendent of business, was here last month, right? And so she gave you that basic breakdown of our grants, of our expenditures, but she wasn't able to share with you what we anticipated to be the changes. So that's what you're going to see tonight. And I'm going to focus in on very specifically the areas that affect us in special education, as I think that's where our interest lies tonight. And as SEAC, this is where we want to have your input as a committee. As you've heard in your purpose of SEAC, one of the things that why SEACs are formed is to advise the board in the development of the budget as it pertains to special education. So that's where we're going to focus tonight. So some of the slideshow that you received on Friday is a repeat of what Roxana shared with us last month. So when you see, I'm going to flip through some of the slides here. So when you see these slides here around our development process, around our objectives, these things, here's our process and timelines. These Roxana shared with you a month ago. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. Where I am going to go is to slide 26, which is right here. Hey, Mike, welcome. So on this slide, this is what, so you didn't see this a month ago, and so I think it's important that we appreciate this. This slide is about our changes for 2019-20 on slide 26. So everything you see in red is a reduction in our funding from this current year. And obviously those things in black are an increase. So And these changes are before our growth. So I just want you to appreciate that. If we had no change in our student enrollment for next year, here are the changes that we would see in our funding for that next year. Our funding increases because of our growth. So sometimes it looks like, oh, but we haven't gone down in our funding. If, to simplify things, if we have 10 students and $10 to fund those students, that's $1 per student. If our population grows to 12 students and we still have $10, now you're down to whatever the math is, 80 cents each or something like that, right? Welcome. So just to put that in perspective, so you're seeing a decrease in funding here before the population increase. Make sense? So our Pupil Foundation grant, you can see, is going down in that first category area. I'll try and show the pointer there. Do you want me to dim the lights further? Would that help? Yeah. Yeah, it's right behind the door if you don't mind. Oh, yeah, go around. That one switch that's up. Thanks, Deidre. So this shows you that our Pupil Foundation grant is dropping by about $25 million. The bulk of them, it's in a number of areas, but the bulk of it is because of the government's change in secondary staffing from a ratio of 22-1, which you've probably heard in the news, down to or up to 28-1. So that's where we're losing about 20 million. And then, and then these other areas, you see some other changes as well. So I want you to be aware of that. Other areas to highlight. Some of these may not. Oh, so here is what is also being talked about in the news is boards are not expected to lay off teachers in order to get to 28-1. So the government has given boards what they're calling attrition protection. So you can see that here. I'm trying to point to that attrition protection. So they're giving us 14 million because they've looked at the projected number of retirements that we have and said that, okay, you won't reach 28-1 next year because you don't have enough retirements and leaves. Therefore, we'll give you this money to continue paying those teachers because you're not at 28-1 yet. Does that make sense? It's only secondary. Yep. So that's what that is. But to understand that those positions are still gone. That makes sense? So I believe we're going to be at 25.8, I think is the number. I may have that right. Is that right, Mayor? Yeah. So we'll be up to that number. So now if across a secondary school, let's say you have 100 teachers, now that school might be down to 90 teachers, but there's still the same number of students. Does that make sense? So even though we have the funding to avoid laying anybody off, I don't want that to cloud the fact that there are now 90 teachers still teaching those 700 students, for example. Does that make sense? So that attrition protection is to make sure that we don't have to lay people off. It's just secondary teachers where that applies. And so, but we have some other reductions. So for example, there's a reduction in our qualifications and experience grant, so that we get funding for all teachers at a base amount, and then teacher by teacher, the province says, okay, so that teacher has 10 years experience, so they get this much additional pay, and they have these qualifications, they got that much additional pay, the board gets that much more funding for that teacher. So the board has to submit the specifics for every single teacher to get that grant money. So we have for example, a reduction of 4.2 million in that we have to find the money elsewhere. That makes sense? They've reduced the Q&E grant, but we still have to pay the teachers for their qualification experience, right? So the funding is that much less. Yeah. Does that, all these grants that you say, well, what's changing? The money is less, and we have to figure out how to do with less. Is the reality there. So that applies all the way through this. The learning opportunities allocation, I'm on the bottom section of the page here, 6.6 million. The previous government, that was a negotiated amount of money to help maintain or increase the number of staff, mostly in special education, that each board had. So it was a formula to generate that amount. We've had it for the last 2 years. It's now gone. So that's why you see that number gone there. So you can see overall that our decrease outside of growth is 22 million. And if we didn't have the attrition protection dollars, it'd be 36 million. So I think I've said to you before that, there's a lot of press around different pieces of this, but all these other grants, it's hard for the public to understand these, right? So they're not getting a lot of press, but every board is in this same boat of having all these other reductions here that in the end impacts the overall budget. So we can see our reduction there of 22 million. So I'm going to flip ahead to slides 55 to 58. And sorry, if there are other slides that you have a question about, if you had a chance to look through these on the weekend, and there's other slides you'd like to slow me down on, please feel free. Here's slides 55. So here, this is a slide that shows the main reductions in the budget. So that 22 million, we've had to come up with where does that come from? And from the slides that Roxana showed you last month that we're about 75 to 80% of our budget is staff, right? That's the nature of what we do. We provide service and we do that through our staff. And that the other areas of our budget, the vast majority is facilities. So keeping our buildings running, up to date, heated, etc. With a very small portion that's resources and office and clerical, those kinds of things. We actually underspend in those areas. Like our board office administration line, we spend below what the ministry grants us. So, we don't have I guess I'm saying it's not like have a lot of fat to trim. We're pretty lean there already. So with the vast majority of our costs that we can control being staff, that's where the vast majority of our cuts are. So here you can see all the teacher cuts, and you'll notice that there's some pretty big ones in teacher librarians. So we've chosen to go pretty deep there. You can see 24.5 in elementary, and about midway through the secondary line, there's eight there. So we've cut half in every secondary school, and the amount in elementary varies by the size of the school, because that's how we staff it now. But if you look, you can see at the end of each line, you see the number of staff we have in that position. So we're cutting 24.5 out of 49. So half of our teacher librarians, and same with 8 out of 16 in secondary. So we've cut half in both of those areas. Then you can see the other, so I will point to up there, you see near the bottom of elementary teachers, 5 special education and learning resource teachers. We have a total of 29. Look above there, 2 lines up, 4 elementary LRTs. There's 24 there, and then there's all of those. We've been funding contributing funding for 5 of those 29 LRTs in our system. These are teachers that deliver our leveled literacy intervention program, LLI, and across our elementary schools. And so we've been paying for 5 of those out of our spec ed funding because a number of those students have special needs. And so we recognize that we should pay for some of that out of our grant. And then you can also see down at the bottom of that elementary line, 7 spec ed itinerant teachers. It says out of 19. So to be clear, we have 9 itinerant resource teachers that support across all of our schools, doing a range of work, largely in the classroom, modeling, coaching for teachers, helping them with specific strategies to work with their students. So the other 10 that are there, I believe there's 5, I'm going to turn to Sean, 5 are with our blind and low vision team, and 5 are with our deaf and hard of hearing team. So we have those 2 itinerant teams that work directly with students. Those 2 teams are remaining the same, 5 IRTs, itinerant resource teachers, in both of those teams. The remaining 9 itinerant resource teachers we've reduced in this process. I'll tell you what's happened. There's the other side of that coin, which I'll get to, because we've done some restructuring in our department. The other reductions I'm going to point to here in secondary is in the second last one. Oh, what did I do? Summer. Oh, okay, it's back. One of those, a little loose. One of those itinerant resource teachers is in our secondary panel. So you can see that reduction there. And you see for 5.8 certs reduced. So what that is, 1.3 of those, they've lumped them in together here. I say lump, our finance folks. 1.3 of those people is the teacher of the props program. Have I talked about that here earlier? Yes, no. Props is a program that runs out of Acton District High School. We used to have one down at White Oaks School in Oakville, but we closed it for lack of students. It runs currently in Acton, and it's for high school students with some pretty complex mental health needs. And so the numbers in that program have been dwindling for the last few years, and it's been staffed pretty richly with a teacher and part of a CYC and an EA. And the reason why the numbers have been dropping is because we're serving those students quite well in our schools and able to support them there. And some of the really complex needs are being addressed by some of our community partners. So, so we've decided to close that props class. The other 4.5 of that number, that 5.8 at the bottom, I said that 1.3 is props. The other 4.5, those are certs that work in our high schools. And we decided that we could do a reduction there. And so if you're wondering how we got the number 4.5, it's the equivalent of adding 1 class to the workload of each cert. So if a cert, for example, supports 10 classes in a high school, they now have 11. Does that make sense? That's how, when we did the math, we developed the number 4.5. And then the last number there is a reduction of 17 instructional program leaders. All of those, I guess I don't need to point those out, all of those are in our other departments. We didn't have a reduction there in special education. So those are coming out of secondary programs, elementary program, research, equity. Have I missed one? So you can see we're basically cutting half of our, some boards call them consultants, program curriculum consultants. We call them IPLs. So we basically cut that staffing complement in half. So that's that slide. Feel free to ask questions, please. I'll point through some other ones here. Student supervisors, the top line. The 12.3 reduction, these are our, I'd say that mostly, if not all, parents who come in to help out during our nutrition breaks. So most of them come in for an hour a day and help supervise our classrooms. They're not volunteers, they're paid staff. And so that 12.3, I'm not even sure, what does a 1.0 equal? Sean, do you know? Is 1.07 people? Because they're an hour each, I think. I think that's right. Does that make sense, right? If you have 7 people working an hour each, that's 7 hours. That's, I think, the equivalent of a 1.0. Because this is a full-time staffing equivalent. No, it's not even that, because that's only 7 hours. They should be 35 hours, I think. Sorry, I don't know the exact math. You get the idea that we're reducing the number of student supervisors that out of 71.8, we're doing a 12.3 reduction. And we're working with our schools to become more efficient in designing their supervision schedules so that they can still provide appropriate support to our students, but reduce that cost. So that's what that means there. I'm going to skip by some of these other areas. You might want to ask about caretakers or others, but and then part of this is just so you're aware of how we've spread our reductions across basically every area of the board. We have reduced 2 of our clerical staff in our department. So you see the 12.9 FTE of central clerical staff. 2 of those have come out of student services. I mentioned about with that props class closing, the 1 EA there. We have 4 EAs that work with students that are English language learners, and we have 13 that work in the food schools. You can see we're reduced 5 overall there. Here are 2 specific to our work. We're reducing 2 child and youth counselors out of 49. They work mostly in elementary schools. 1 psychoeducational consultant, that's a psychologist. 1 out of 21 is a reduction there. You can see some central principals been reduced and some other management and support staff. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. I do have a page that kind of zooms in on the spec ed pieces, so I'll go there. Here are some other reductions.
Mark, we have some questions.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry, with the psychoeducational consultant, will that affect the timeline in terms of the wait list for children that are waiting to have their assessment?
Great question, thanks. So in our deliberations about that reduction, we don't want that to happen. And so we've looked at how we can be more efficient with our assessments. And we've decided to, if any of you have seen a psych ed report that our staff develop, it's quite detailed. There's a lot of info there. We've looked at the reports that are produced by psych staff and other boards. I'd say ours is probably some of the longest, most detailed. And we've talked for years about how well is that information used, digested, turned into, sort of well-informed programming and instruction for our kids. And so we've decided we've developed more of a template that our staff will follow as opposed to some of the longer narrative that you see in those assessments, to trim it down, move all the recommendations to the front. We think that's really where people go. So bring those up to the front there, compress some of the other information to the more specific detail that's needed there, and therefore reduce the time needed to write reports. So we felt that by doing that, we could compress the work down and maintain the number of assessments that we do every year. Okay?
Mark, we have two more.
Sure, go ahead, Joanna.
Mark, thanks. Just wondering if you could elaborate on what factors were used to determine the decreases in special education learning resource teachers, and how will those, how will that student load, the student needs be addressed in light of those decreases,
Sure.
reductions?
So I've gone back to that slide. So you can see that there are a total then of 9 out of 29 LRTs reduced, right? That's this line here, the 4, and then the 5 down here. So you can see the totals here. So there's 9 out of 29. So in the end, 2 things that we've decided to do there. One is that an LRT teacher typically spends half their day working directly with students and the other half of the day back in the classroom coaching staff on how to support those students with the skills that they've learned in the regular classroom. So, we've looked broadly across the work. So if you look down at the bottom of that page again, that we've cut our IPLs in half. We're asking our remaining LRTs to pick up some of the work that IPLs do. Actually, if you look back up at the top there, 8 math coaches, they're going to be doing a little bit of math coaching in that time as well. So we're compressing some of the work. Obviously, they won't be able to do it as deeply and richly as they have before, but that's a bit of what we're doing. And they won't be able to serve as many schools as they have been. When you go from 29 to 20, we have they're basically spread across X number of schools. I'm not sure how that distribution, but there's going to be fewer schools getting that support. It's basically some of our schools where we have our greatest needs in terms of students learning to read is where that support goes. So it's going to be spread a little more thinly. Hope that helps. Other questions?
Diane?
I guess I'm concerned that the psych ed consultants are going to be cut when we have over 6,000 students who are not identified and probably need psych assessments. That would be one of my concerns. And I would really like to know if we have the data that says having 17 IPLs is rich. Because if it's rich, then it can afford to be cut. But if it's not rich, then it can't afford to be cut. And I know we have a budget, and we know we have to meet the government's demands, but I also think we have to tell the government that their demands are hurting our kids terribly.
Yeah. Fair, very fair comment, Diane. I'm going to get to some slides and things in a moment to show you some of our totals. We've tried to keep, one of our overriding premises of our decisions has been to try to keep the cuts as far from kids in the classroom as we could. That's hard when you have so many, almost all of our education-based staff work with kids. Very, very few don't, right? Our IPLs, for example, don't work directly with kids. They work with teachers, right? They're building capacity in teachers. So, obviously we wouldn't be doing that in the first place if we didn't value it. We know that all the research says that the number one thing that impacts student achievement is the quality of the teaching, right? So the more we grow the skills and knowledge of our teachers, the better. So We've gone at these cuts with a lot, we've been talking about this since November, in anticipation of these cuts. So this has been very difficult. But for example, it's why we chose to go with our teacher librarians. They work with students, but not as directly as our teachers do, as our certs do. You don't see any elementary certs here cut, for example, even though we have hundreds of them, but we've decided, to not go there. So these haven't been easy decisions, Diane. You could rationalize every one of these why it shouldn't happen. So, because I believe there's value in all the work of these staff. But in the end, we had to cut 22 million, right? So that's where it's at. So Diane over here, I think, had the next.
You did. My question's sort of tailored both into a follow-up with what you were discussing with Joanna about the reduction of the 9 of the 29. And you mentioned that we'll have to go where there's the greatest need because they won't be able to go to as many schools. What happens to the children where there is a need that they're now not going to be able to reach?
Great question, thanks. So to appreciate that, those 29 weren't working in every school either, right? We didn't have enough of those staff to go across all schools. So the decisions around which schools to put these staff at, we look at the reading scores of those students. We look at very specifically what levels they're reading at, how many there are, because you need to have a critical mass of enough students to warrant that staff member working with them with the LLI program. So for example, if there's only 2 students reading at that level, we're not going to put an LLI teacher there when they could be working at another school with 10, for example, right?
Right.
Not that those 2 aren't in need of the support, but we always have to be good stewards of our resources. So we make decisions based on the needs of the students in the schools and that critical number to make it, sort of bang for the buck. So in all those other places, there aren't those LLIs working. However, the resources for working with those students are in every school. We made sure that the LLI kits are in every elementary school, and we have trained our certs and a number of our classroom teachers to work with those resources and work with those students. So just because they don't have an LLI teacher doesn't mean they're not getting some of the LLI programming and the supports that go on there. So that's a great question of clarification. So just because they don't have a learning resource teacher working in that school doesn't mean the support isn't happening. It just isn't happening with a dedicated staff member.
Okay.
Fair enough?
Okay, fair enough. And the follow-up question to what Diane was saying, the concern I have with some of the cuts, and again, I know you can only spend what you have and you have to try and find the funds somewhere, is in the other report that I was reading through, it said Halton had one of the highest and fastest growing needs in terms of both mental health and also in the learning disabilities and then the ones that are not necessarily with an IEP. And so I'm just concerned both for safety and the resources and the teacher support and the training within the classroom and just how all of that is going to be managed. To your point earlier, that this hasn't even taken into account the growth and you're having to do these cuts. So I'm just concerned about safety and also the ability to learn for some of the kids.
Yeah, thanks. Great observation and great question. Certainly at no point in time would we be making a decision that would jeopardize the safety of a student. That said, that means that in order to ensure the safety of all students, we have to draw resources from other places to do that, right? So that's why you see reductions in these other roles in order to do that. And some of it is, a relooking, a restructuring of what that work looks like. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on, because we've had to be rethinking. So if for example, look at the IPLs at the bottom being cut in half, our school programs departments and equity and research all are completely rethinking how they're going to do their work because there's only half of them, right? That's a reality of what they're going to have to do. Our teacher librarians, cut in half, elementary and secondary. We're reimagining those roles and what they're going to be able to do because they have half the time in our schools. So that's a reality that all boards are going to have to do in this upcoming budget year. So thanks for that. Shall I move on? So I'm down to this slide now. This is 57. Non-staffing areas where we've also have been doing reductions. So you can see that top one there, we've adjusted the bell times of some schools. We have some later starts at some schools, which is reducing the number of runs. So we can take buses off the road in order to do that. There's some late times there for some of them, but that's happening. Some of the others here, I'm not going to go line by line there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. But you can see the point of this slide is to show you that all of our reductions aren't just in staff. We've been looking at other places where we could make reductions. And then the last slide I want you to see is this slide of additions. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was, I'm pretty sure we're going to have the language differently on this slide tomorrow because that's not we're not going to keep the spray painters off the building somehow, or it's charges that go against the vandalism, because we have a budget line called vandalism, so it's the things that are charged against that line, because we're trying to be more efficient, and I can't remember what word we said was going to be there. If it's more about sorry, I'm drawing a blank. We were talking about this at admin council yesterday, but yeah, it looks fair enough. It's a word. It's an odd word there, but the language will be different in the board presentation tomorrow. So, but it's in facilities, and there's going to be a reduction in whatever the area the new language says. Sorry, I've drawn a blank there. Any other questions there? Diane?
When I take a look at that list, I'm really concerned that an awful lot of them are hitting our high needs kids. School technology purchases is going to mean success or failure for specific kids. Kids with learning disabilities, kids with autism.
Okay, so can I clarify that one?
And
just, or do you want to talk more generally about what's there?
And the Bronte Creek program is a specific program for a group of kids who desperately need to stay in school, and that's one of the only ways that we've been able to keep them in school.
Yeah, thanks. The Bronte Creek program, for those of you that don't know, it's basically an outdoor ed program that was developed 20 or 30 years ago, quite a while ago, and has kind of morphed over time. It was, had very much an environmental focus in the past. And I'll say, Diane, that there are we certainly have some students for whom that has really helped with their re-engagement with school. That's not the focus of the program. That it's really environmental education is the focus of it. It just happens to be highly engaging for some. And it was also developed at a time when we didn't have some other programs. So for example, our specialist high schools major programs, we call them SHISMs here in Halton, I think we have 2 of them that have an outdoor ed environmental focus, for example. And we have far more programs focused on student engagement and re-engagement than we ever had. I know that our Associate Director, David Bogue, has been looking closely at our Gary Allen School, which is a alt-ed school. It encompasses both our alternative programs for students that are school age, re-engaging them, students who are at risk of not continuing in high school, and also encompasses our adult ed programs as well. The numbers in the school age program have been dropping for a number of years, not because the needs aren't there, but because we're doing a better and better job of meeting those needs in the regular high schools. So I'm telling you about that because similar to those needs being met elsewhere, similar with Bronte Creek, the numbers have been dropping in Bronte Creek. We don't run it at full capacity, again, because ideally we don't want our students to have to ever leave our schools because we can't meet their needs. Ideally, we want all of them, right from K to 12, being able to stay in their home school and have their needs met there, right? So we're doing a better and better job of that, and therefore we have fewer and fewer students going to Bronte Creek. And it's by far the most expensive, one of the most expensive programs we have going. I think we have 54 students in that program this year, and I should know this because we've been talking about it so much. I think it's about double the cost of the programming in a regular high school. It's just very, very expensive. So once again, we wouldn't have been running it all these years if we didn't think it had value. Certainly we have, but we have to make some difficult decisions in this process. And so Bronte Creek is one of the areas that we decided to find those savings. So, but not to recognize the value that you're talking about, Diane. The technology purchases, you're going to see that elsewhere where we brought that back. But for students with special needs, well, first off, what this would mean, because we were giving schools money for technology to renew their computers, et cetera, every 2 years. It was on a 2-year cycle. This reduction would have made it every 3 years. But we've brought that money back. You'll see how in a later slide. But it doesn't touch the technology that students get through the SIA grant. So if you're familiar with that, that those are devices that students get through a prescription. If they have a whole range, there's quite a range of why students would qualify for that. That remains unchanged, just to clarify that.
Diane has one more comment.
Clarification. With the reduction in the Bronte Creek, because it was an outdoor ed and environmental program, you're saying it's being addressed in the schools. So is it being addressed in the schools and letting the kids out of the classroom because some of them don't survive in those 4 walls?
For sure, some of that is happening, both in the regular schools and through programs like the SHISMs that I mentioned. We also have been working with schools for a while about how to get out of the classroom. So our school programs department, as well as our sustainability officer, has been providing great professional development outside the classroom, showing teachers how to bring their learning out of the 4 walls, onto the schoolyard, into the ravines, into our green spaces. We've been developing outdoor classroom spaces nonstop in our schools. Most schools you drive by, if you can't see it from the street, if you go around back, you'll see those outdoor spaces as well where that can happen. So it's been a focus, and it will continue to be a focus. Okay. So additions. It's not all cuts. As I said, we've been restructuring through this process, and here's where you will see some additions. So adding 9 elementary teachers because of growth. Same with ECEs. You can see the add there. You can see some other areas being added with secondary. Focus here on on library technicians. So we have teacher librarians working in each library. Depends on, once again, the size of the school dictates the amount. Anywhere from, I think, 0.3 is the current smallest number up to a 1.0. But we also have library technicians that do more of the technical side of the work. So in terms of cataloging, the barcoding, the sign-out system, the shelving, maintaining the inventory of the library is done by a technical person. These are members of our office clerical and technical unit. So the secretarial group is these library technicians. So we've increased this number in recognition of the reduction in teacher librarians. So it's, why didn't we just keep the teacher librarians? Because they're about double the cost. So these aren't certified teachers and do some work with students, but not the same. So part of this is because we want to make sure we keep our libraries open. It's certainly an important learning space in the school. And so that's why you see that number added there. You can see 2 more self-contained classes added. Here, if I said on a previous slide that we were reducing 9 IRTs in our department, itinerant resource teachers, here halfway down you can see 6, here it is here, 6 spec ed IPLs. So we have 2 roles of itinerant staff currently out there supporting our schools. An itinerant program leader and an itinerant resource teacher. So we decided if we're going to need to make a reduction here in student services, let's restructure our work and how we do it. So we've gone from 8 current IPLs and 9 IRTs, so 17 in total right now, down to, we're keeping our current 8 and adding 6 more IPLs, so we're going from 17 down to 14. And all of our staff are now IPLs. Does that make sense? So the net reduction is 3. It looked like 9 before. It's actually only 3. And we've restructured because, so now the IPL role is actually a bit of a blend where we kind of drew the line before and said, IPLs, you're doing more of a, I want to say curriculum. I guess it is a curriculum leadership, instructional support, a lot of leading portfolios and administrative pieces, et cetera. And then we said IRTs, you're more of the in-class coach. We've blended the 2 together, if that makes sense. So now these roles, these staff in these roles would be doing some of the job description of both in the past and some reimagining we've done with this as well. So that's why you see that addition there. 6 additional EAs in spec ed, basically for growth. We've looked at our growth number there and said we're going to need to add some EAs to keep up to that growth number. Anticipating the change in the Ontario Autism Program, knowing that we're going to be having students with more needs coming in. So we've set aside this $700,000. That doesn't have a specific role beside it because we're working more with our community agencies like Aaron Oak and others to say, so what are the needs of those students and how best can we meet those? In some cases, it might be an EA. In some cases, it might be an ABA facilitator. It could be CYCs that are needed, et cetera. So we're sort of reimagining there, and a huge part of this, and you've heard me say this before, is the unknown. We still don't know what the Ontario Autism Program is going to look like. Therefore, we don't know the profile of the needs that are coming and the volume. So once that becomes clearer, then we'll have a better idea of how to spend that money to meet the needs of those students. So that's why we've set that aside. And I think I'll stop there with those. There's other areas there, but those are the ones that are specific to spec ed. So those are the additions that we've brought into the budget in our work to restructure. And the last slide I'm going to go to, if you want me to go to others, we can. The last slide I'm going to go to is 62. For the first time in a while, we're going to submit to the ministry a deficit budget. So school boards by law can't run a deficit more than 1%. So where other organizations might say, we're going to run this much of a deficit, 2%, 5%, whatever they want to do, and we're going to find the money in this way. They're going to draw from reserves, or they're going to take out a loan, or whatever that is. School boards can't do that by law. The most you can run a deficit is 1%. So some boards do this every year. They overspend what they've got, and they figure out where to get that money or how to plan for that. We haven't done this. This is my 12th year in this role, and we've never done it in my time. So this is new for us, but we feel that the significance of these cuts is pretty large, and we want to try and buffer it in this year as best we can. We've debated about, are we putting off the pain to another year? You could certainly think that way, but we've decided, if you take a look at the size of it, so our budget is about $760 million, and we're planning, we could run, well, I guess in operating, sorry, because 1% of 680 million, because we have our capital on top of that. So let's say 680 million. So 1%, we could run up to a $6.8 million deficit. We're not. We're going to run a deficit of, it's at the, it's up right up there. Thanks. Yeah, 2.5 million. So 0.37%. is the, and so we've chosen to do that for a couple reasons. It's partly to buffer the impact of what's going on, partly because we tend to be pretty conservative in our budgeting, and when we come into the fall next year, we have to develop a revised budget. So once our enrollment truly, we really see our enrollment and all of our other things are realized, it's not uncommon for us to realize, oh, we have $1 million less expense than we thought, or we have this much carried over from the previous year that we didn't spend. And so we think that we can realize or find some of that 2.5 million through that. And then some of the others you can see there, we're going to spread out that cost over 2 or more years, because we have to submit to the province. If we run a deficit, we have to have a recovery plan that we submit with that deficit. So we are, here's the sort of the broad strokes of that recovery plan. And so Diane, back to your question about computer technology, some things that are a one-time expense, we're including in this deficit that, like I said, will only cost us one time to do it, and therefore that expense won't be there the next year. Does that make sense? So top of that list, Diane, is $200,000 in computer technology. So we have brought that back to almost eliminate that reduction by this deficit budget. Does that make sense? So the total of one-time expenses is just over 800,000. So I've thrown a lot at you, even though I've only pointed to about 5 slides out of I don't know how many. But I'm sure you can appreciate a budget of 760 million is pretty complex, and there's a lot of detail there. So can I take you to the other doc, which really just shows you the spec ed impact? Is that okay? So I'm going to go out of this. I think it's here. This, yeah. I need to make this bigger for you. Is that good enough? So our finance folks have tried to pull together for you all of the specific funding and expenses around spec ed. So some of this I appreciate is maybe more detailed than you want, but just to quickly say, if you see a number in without brackets, it's an increase. In brackets is a reduction. So for example, remember when I talked about the qualification and experience grant going down? That affects all teachers, including certs and self-contained teachers, right? So the portion of that is included in our special education staff, there's the impact there, 1.4 million, almost 1.5. You can see a few other increases where you don't see brackets. And so you see that overall, we have an increase of 827,000 in spec ed. That includes growth. Without the growth, we have a reduction. Okay? So you see that there. Here are our specific revenue grants from the ministry. And once again, you can see the ups and downs. So our special education per pupil amount has gone up. This is our, column D is our current expense. Column C is the draft budget expense, grant amount for 2019-2020. So this is what we're going to be getting. This is what we get right now. So you can see it's gone up 1.8 million. So, but all of those are generated per pupil. Does that make sense? That's the only reason they're going up is because we have more students. You can see where there's reductions. The big one is down here in local priority funding. And I said to you that was in the provincial contract with teachers for the last 2 years, and that has been discontinued with this new budget year coming. So almost 3 million there. So local priority funding, it was a negotiated part of the last centrally negotiated contract between the province and the unions, and so in that amount, it was broken down by union group. So for example, in elementary teachers, I don't have the numbers here, but for example, let's say elementary teachers was $1 million and secondary teachers was 500,000 and the EA union was 200,000, et cetera. So all those amounts across all the union groups, I think almost every union group, maybe not all, but most, got a portion. They didn't get it. Boards got a portion of the local priority amount, and the intention was to either add staff or in our case we were going to have to do some reductions, because if you were the previous SEAC table, we had 4 years of reductions because our I'm drawing a blank. Help me out, Diane. We had 4 years of reductions of our, it's now the Decena budget. God, I lived this for 4 years of budget cuts. Now I'm forgetting. We have a grant from the ministry, and it's now called this one here, Differentiated Special Education Needs Amount. The ministry rejigged their formula for this and decided that some boards were getting too much and others boards were getting not enough. We were on the losing end. The ministry determined that we were getting too much of this grant, and therefore we had to do a $8 million reduction over 4 years. They spread it out over 4 years in order to get ourselves in line. Recall all this? And so No, sorry, we had to reduce 8 million a year. We were almost 30 million over. So we had to reduce 8 million a year in our spec ed funding to get ourselves in line with the new formula. So when this local priorities money came along, it helped. We were going to have to be doing, we did a number of reductions in the past. Some of the ones we talked about here most, for example, was the Learning Center. We closed those classes. We reduced a number of other positions because of those cuts. And but like I said, this local priority funding helped us reduce the reduction, if that makes sense, over the last couple of years. But when this money is now gone, positions that we funded with the local priorities grant were now vulnerable, or at least unfunded in this process. Does that make sense? So that's what the local priority part of this is. So you can see that overall in our spec ed revenue, all these different grants were down about $1 million. So
Mark?
now,
Joanna has a question.
yeah, sorry.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah.
Can you explain what the approved special incidents portion is?
So we have, this we call the SIP grant. The ministry has a process by which we can apply for funding for a specific student who has needs that are high enough to qualify for this grant. And the needs are largely around behavior and the amount of care that they need to support them to be safe in school, both themselves and other students. So in a nutshell, the ministry's criteria is that if a student needs 2 staff to support them, so a 2-to-1 ratio, if there's more detail I should give, Sean, if you want to add anything more, it's basically if a student needs 2-to-1, then they can qualify for this grant. So the number of students really varies year to year, right? Because it's whoever's in our system that qualifies for it. I guess I consider it a bit unfortunate because the ministry says if the student has this high enough level of need, we'll give you this money in recognition that the student often needs 2-to-1, not all the time through the day, but at different points in the day needs 2-to-1. And the amount of funding is the equivalent of about a half EA. So you do the math, that's how extreme the need is, and yet we only get half of a staff person in additional funding. So
sorry, Mark, so to clarify, it's based on current enrollment, what we know about our students and their needs.
Right. So we have to apply for every specific student. So if I'm one of those students, a claim goes in for Mark Zonneveld, and we submit all those claims to the ministry. They're all assessed and comes back with, and I haven't had any turn back in my 5 years in the role, but we submit it's quite a monstrous document that we submit and in order to get that money. So how much that is every year, it can be 2 million one year, it could be 1 million the next. It just depends on who's in our system at the time.
Okay, so with the changes to autism program funding, if we do get more students with more needs starting September or into the year,
some of those students do qualify for a SIP grant. Yeah, some of them do, and so we always apply if that's appropriate.
So will that number change then? Will we be able to reapply during the course of the year?
Yeah, we'll wait to hear from the ministry, but this current year, when the ministry initially announced the changes to the OAP, a month or so later, when they talked about supports for school boards, they did because there's a deadline. I think it's January. Is that right, Sean? Right around January is the deadline to submit all your SIP applications for that year. So normally any students that come in after that deadline, you're out of luck to the next year. So they extended the SIP deadline for any students that are in the OAP that were coming in the spring. So we ended up not needing to apply because then they changed they delayed the implementation of the OAP and those students didn't come. So come September, we would be able to apply for them like we would any other year up until that deadline in December or January. Will they extend it beyond that? I don't know. But so we would normally apply if they meet the criteria. Other questions? Okay, so I'm going to change tabs on this and show you these numbers here, because what Business Services has done is they've teased out this column C. Sorry, I'll make this bigger for you. So they've teased out column C for you to see where the reductions are specifically to Spec Ed. So there you can see the dollar amounts. I think we've talked about all of these. And so I wanted to point this out to you. Here's the number of full-time equivalent staff that we're reducing for next year. 227 staff. Just wanted you to be aware of that, have that perspective. We're the biggest employer in Halton, so with all of our part-time staff included, I think we're pushing close to 10,000 staff. But just wanted you to be aware of that. I know there's been lots of talk in the news saying there will be no layoffs. Just understand the reduction. So you can see all the in that column C. And then, so that was, and now you see the ads down here, right? That's what the dollar amounts are here in column C, because above that they were in brackets. Now these are ads. And
Question?
Yep.
So, okay, so you've got, can you scroll up again or down,
Yeah.
whichever way to go back to what you were at before? So the reductions, the 227.3,
Yep.
that's there in brackets.
Yeah.
And then you scroll up.
Up.
No, the other way.
This way,
That way.
yeah.
So then you've got down a little bit more. There you go. And then
Yeah.
you've got the 38.5. Are those separate numbers, or should those be combined so that it comes out really at about 190 something like that?
Yeah,
That's what I'm
great.
asking.
Thank you. Great question. Yeah. So 38.5 addition. Yes, thank you. Because these are across these other areas. Thanks. Yep. So do that subtraction. And we come out to, so here again, column C is the total reduction in Spec Ed is just under 500,000. So I know that the things that I've shared, you're thinking, wow, there's a lot of touches in Spec Ed. There certainly are. I'm showing you this in hopes that you can see there are a lot of areas that we've added back and tried to buffer as much as we can the impact, and that the total impact is about $500,000. So to put that in perspective, out of a $760 million budget, about $100 million is Spec Ed, so a seventh, an eighth. And then the $22 million we showed in reduction to the budget in our revenue, the Spec Ed reduction is only $500,000. So we've really constantly through our budget discussions tried to keep the reductions away from the classroom and kept on saying we got to keep this as much as we can away from Spec Ed. And I know staff, when they've seen this, they've said, wow, we thought this would be way worse in terms of what it would look like for our department. And my answer is that, in our decision making, we know how much we don't want this to impact kids, and we know how much our kids with special needs benefit from the supports that we provide. And I think it's also a vote of confidence in our staff in being able to meet those needs. And so we've really tried to minimize that. Not to say that there aren't touches along the way, but we've really tried to minimize that. So I think I'll stop there. I've taken a good chunk of time, and The intent here, my intent is to help you understand what those look like, those impacts. And I can go back to those so you can see them where the staffing impacts are. And then to open this up to questions, comments, suggestions, etc.
I ask a question of clarification,
Sure.
please. Okay, so scroll back to the bottom,
Yep.
I guess is where,
How far down?
keep going.
Tell me when to
Keep
stop.
going. Stop there.
Okay.
Okay, so when you're looking at the full-time equivalent of staff, it says that there is a reduction of 38.5 full-time equivalent, correct? So
The 38.5 is an addition of staff.
addition of staff. Oh, right, sorry, the 227 staff, so that's right, okay, so the
there.
227.3 full-time equivalent staff are
Yeah.
being reduced.
Correct.
Then you scroll down to the bottom,
Yep.
and the total spec ed reduction is $447,000.
Correct.
That doesn't make sense to me. As far as if we've lost,
Because the 227 isn't just spec ed,
no,
right? You've got,
so that's across so they're different numbers. They're not necessarily.
yeah, the spec ed is just column C, right? Here's all, what you see on this doc is all of the reductions in positions for the entire system.
But then,
And then column C shows specifically the ones that are spec ed. That's why you're seeing a dollar amount over there to show line 12, right?
Yep.
This is spec ed. This is spec ed, et cetera. So when you add up when you do all the math on column C, you see all the reductions in brackets, and then you see the additions down here, and that's why the math is 447.
okay.
Does that help? I know it's very complex. It's very complex. I apologize for that.
If you went through and counted up the FTEs in brackets with a dollar sign beside it, those would be the spec ed versus the 227.
Yeah. The number of positions. We can do the math right now. Yeah, just we don't have that showing, so we can do the math. Can someone want to take a total as we go? Get 5 plus 7 is 12, 13. We're at 18.8 there. This is only 2. So this is, I said 18.8, this is now 2, 20.8, 21.8, 22, 23, 24. Yeah, so 24 positions in spec ed, but let's go back here. Then we're adding back in 14, so 10. Is that right? I think it's 10 positions in spec ed. Our department itself is about 200, and then you have to add in all the self-contained teachers, all the certs, which is another 400 or so, I'm guessing, Sean. Certs, self-contained, maybe. Does that help at all? So about 10 spec ed staff, and that's across, with the 2 CYCs, the 1 psych, 2 clerical, 5 LRTs, 5.8 secondary certs. I'm missing someone in there, but then we're adding back, you can see we're adding back, 3 of our IRTs. Yeah, so it's about 10 in total. Other questions?
All right, my question's multifaceted because I was reading today the review that was sent as well, the summary of the findings of the Spec Ed review. And please keep in mind, as my day job is that I have my master's degree in gifted education. I teach a contained gifted class, and I have for the last 20 years. I'm a firm believer in the need for gifted education. I think it's valuable for kids from time to time. But what shocks me here is that the Halton District School Board has a 10% increase in the number of students receiving gifted services. And we know what that is. That's because Halton is one of the very few boards that provide primary gifted. It is just, it's a startling thing when you look, I mean, I don't know what page that is on there, but it's just startling to see that 10%, we're 10% higher than the provincial average in terms of the kids receiving gifted support. So my other question is those 2 contained classrooms that are being added, do you know specifically what they are? Are they life skills classes? Are they comm classes? Are they gifted classes? Because, yeah.
Good question. So last month, I believe I shared with you the changes in self-contained classes in my superintendent report. So you saw ups and downs, you know, where, for example, maybe a behavior resource class closed at one school, and then an LD class opened at another, and another class moved schools, etc. So all that goes on in our system, and included in all that activity there are gifted classes, because we have, those numbers go up and down as well. So that 2 that you see added is across all of it. So we'd have to go back and break it down and go, oh, so overall we're up an LD class and we're down a life skills and we're up a gifted, like that's, all those cancel each other out to get to an addition of 2. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't tell you, I don't have the numbers here to say if there's an actual rise in the number of gifted. I will say, though, that all of our self-contained classes those are all placements through the IPRC process. If as a board, if a school board chooses to offer that, because you don't have to, right? You don't have to have any self-contained classes as a board. That's, the province isn't telling you how to meet the needs of your kids. It gives you options. So if a school board chooses to offer a self-contained placement, such as gifted at whatever grade level, then as a board, we can't say to a family, sorry, we're full. So if the children meet the criteria for that class and the family decides we would like to have their child placed, you know, as opposed to their other placement options, but if they choose self-contained, we as a board are obliged to make sure there are enough classes to accommodate those students. So we would have to, in order to impact the number of self-contained classes, we have to make changes as a board to the criteria for those classes in order to change the number of students that might go in them, up or down.
And again, I feel like I can speak to this issue because it is literally something I do and deal with every day.
Sure.
Just the costs associated with busing students to these contained classrooms in a gifted class. There's, you know, my son is in a life skills class. There is a massive difference in terms of the needs of the gifted student and in terms of and I'm not saying one is more important, or I'm not saying whatever, but I'm saying, you know, busing 25 students who aren't local to a school to a gifted, you know, grade 1 or gifted grade 2, that is a huge cost that I think just stands out in terms of this review. When we're looking at cutting all of these other things for certain other students, I mean, I don't think the political climate is going to get much better in the next little while, and I think that's something, you know, I would say, I'm not sure if others agree, but that really stuck out to me, and my concern that we get rid of, you know, maybe some, even, you know, the life skills classes tend to get those students that have been in the OAP program because they haven't been able to be successful in a regular school. So they've been in a private autism facility, let's say. They're now re-entering our system. And we've talked about the SIP grants and we've talked about the need for more EAs. But really the needs that those kids are coming with are, behavioral and physical and, life skills needs. Many can't toilet, many can't feed. Those types of needs, in my personal opinion, even though I am a teacher of gifted students and I value them like you can't believe, those needs far trump those needs. So my concern is all these students coming back and flooding the life skills classes because we really don't have a contained, in the Halton board, there's no contained autism classes, let's say. That's going to be a major concern. And I think a real fear for a parent of a student who cannot even, he requires an aid more so to keep him safe. So that's something I think has to be at least discussed at some point.
Thanks. The timing of the review reports and our budget work hasn't necessarily lined up, right? The review has been, ongoing, and I've been sort of, pushing us, and our reviewer as quick as we could along. And we have talked about, as senior staff, about where else do we look for efficiencies and for savings? And, we're just talking with spec ed in our discussion today, right? You can imagine we've talked very broadly about all this. And so within the spec ed side of our work, we did talk about the content coming through in terms of the review, and, the review report's just coming now. So we felt that, we've valued the review, and this is the third phase of it now. And we've had some good recommendations that we've been implementing along the way from the review. For example, in the autism side of things, one of the things we've started is our structured learning class pilot, right, which is focused on kids with autism. So we have 2 of those classes in place right now. So those recommendations have been great, and we wanted to allow the review to bring information forth for us to then consider. So, here's a budget, developed for next year, and then, which has gone on for months, and at the last moment along comes the review. So it really hasn't matched up, and we've talked about this as a senior team and said, let's let the review come. Here it is. There's lots to consider there. I don't know, was there 100 pages or so across the 2 docs, or 80, whatever it is? There's a lot of information to consider. And I'm not sure if I would be surprised if this is just the beginning of funding changes from the province. This might just be the first year of changes that we're seeing. So there's going to be time, opportunity, sadly, to consider what those further changes look like, and how do we incorporate recommendations from the review. Does that make sense? So I don't want you, the review isn't lost. It's late for the budget for next year.
I think the difficulty, too, is that we don't want to be fighting for, scraps in this pot. We want to support all students with all, part of the spec ed budget, and we want to make sure they're well equipped to learn the best that they possibly can. But I think there's also some time to, we live in as you've said, we live in a board that is generally well financed in terms of parent support, and in terms of parents being able to send their kids to get a private psych education consultant, sometimes at the age of 4 years old, which again, in an experience, so we live in an area, a very affluent area, not all, I'm not generalizing, but we definitely have this push that even when I scroll down one more, the discrepancy between the provincial average, I think we have 20.9% that receive gifted support in the elementary panel compared to the provincial average of 7.5. So in that case, there's a 13% difference. And that has to be, I know why that is, but all other we are below the provincial average, with the exception of gifted. And so I think that's something that I would like to just bring out there.
September, you're sort of preempting my superintendent report, but I don't mind. So in September, you know, we knew that this would take time. Here we are, you know, we put 45 minutes on the agenda and we're, sorry, over significantly. But we knew that, I know that you will want some time today to talk about these reports, right? That's why they're here. So to do the two of them tonight, we knew we couldn't do, and because we want to do the reports justice as well. So September, that's going to be probably the bulk of our meeting in September will be really surfacing your observations from what you read. There's lots of content there and what the potential implications could be. So I don't want you to think they're lost, because they're not, and there's next year's budget as well. So any other questions on what I've presented? So I guess I'm looking now for, I guess, continuing what Melissa has surfaced, your thoughts, comments, questions, other observations, concerns, advice around the budget that we've developed, the impact for students with special needs. I want to hear that as staff. Our trustees that are here want to hear that as well. I recognize Tracy L. Harrison, our vice chair, is here. Thanks for being here, Tracy. So welcome your, I'll put the lights up and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you, Mark. James?
Yeah, one of my concerns is to see that the student enrollment's expected to rise by 3% approximately, and the number of teachers are going to decrease considerably. I don't know, I haven't factored in the actual percentage. So do you have an idea what the class sizes are going to be like, or the increase in class sizes for both the general population and for the special ed? I know special ed is only 10 teachers, but they will probably increase too in size.
So, yeah, so for, I'm not sure it's 3%. I'd have to see the number. I thought it was more like 1 point. Where'd you get that number from?
Just, I got it on page 14 says.
On the slides?
The overall average. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe it's 1.3% on page 15.
I'm just trying to catch up to you.
I was looking at, might have been looking at the wrong page here.
I think that's secondary.
Yeah, there's a secondary. Yeah. Well, actually, secondary is one of the things too that's increasing the most. And yet,
so I'm on. If you look, I'm on slide. Is it slide 15? I got on screen here. Jim.
Slide 14 and 15.
Okay, so if you look at,
the
so it ends up being there's the up and down across the two, right? So so in secondary, you can see an increase of 2.3% overall, and in elementary it's 1.3. So I'm not sure what that is between the two. Maybe close to. Oh, thanks. Yeah, you're right. Oh yeah, sorry. Thanks. You know these slides better than I do. So yeah, sorry. So slide 13. If you see there, shows us going up by 0.65 in elementary. Slide 14 shows 2.93 in secondary, and then overall it's a 1.3. Okay, so it's still significant. It's still overall 846 students, right? So it's quite a bit. So the there will be fewer secondary teachers. Let me be careful. The ratio of students to teachers, is going to grow, right? It's going from 22, and I wish I had the number. Is it 24.85 or 25 point? 24. Is that right? So, and we're actually going to be, I'm pretty sure, Deborah McFadden, our superintendent of HR, told us the other day, I'm pretty sure we're going to be the highest ratio in the province in the first year. And that's because of our growth. So as we grow more and more students, because we're one of the fastest growing boards, because as you grow more students, it gets you faster to 28-1 because you can't hire teachers for them. Does that make sense? So we'll get there ahead of everybody else. That's not something to celebrate. So, but it's a reality of our growth. Well, normally our growth really helps us because we get more dollars, which helps us do lots of things. In this case, our secondary classes are going to get bigger faster. So to answer your question, you're going to see larger classes in secondary. One of the docs that was sent along, and you got so many docs that came your way with the agenda, was one about, I'm pretty sure we included this in our agenda package, was examples of class sizes for secondary schools. Did we include that? Yeah, we did. So in that you saw how large the number of teachers that would be reduced in a school for next year and how large some of the classes would get. So if you take a look at that, I know you get lots of docs, but take a look at that. And you know that we have some big classes now, right? There are classes of 35, grade 10 apply or academic English in high schools now, right? That's been a reality. But we're going to see, we know some schools are telling us they're going to have to run classes over 40 in some areas. Of course, we're concerned about that, but I think we're more concerned about the classes that won't run. So where principals have to make decisions and say, okay, I know here's the number of teachers I've got and the number of courses that kids want, and the kids have all done their option sheets and signed up. Principals will decide, okay, I'm going to run that grade 12 physics course of only 15 kids because I know those kids, that really want to go in that stream in terms of their academic path. They need that to get into certain programs. So I'm going to run that class. They also decide to run, another class of 12 kids. I mean, that's low, but where some kids need, a locally developed English class. Locally developed is the next level below applied, because otherwise they won't get enough credits to graduate. So principals make those decisions, which is, we appreciate principals doing that in their schools, but they also do that knowing that they got to run that class of 35 in the academic English class to do it. So those decisions are made all the time in high schools. But yeah, I'm sure you can just appreciate they're going to be able to run fewer of those small classes. There are classes they won't be able to run because they don't have enough kids in them, and they're going to have to run some bigger ones. How many, I couldn't say, but mathematically, you can see that's going to have to happen as we get closer and closer to 28-1. So I hope that answers that question for you. Elementary, there is a funding reduction from 4 to 8. It's in one of the slides that I showed you that we're funded at 24.5 to 1, the average from 4 to 8. We've been spending a little bit more than that. So I think we've been at 23 point something. We're being forced at 24.5. So funding wise, you're going to see a slight rise in the 4 to 8 class size because we have less money there. There is no change in the size of self-contained classes because those are all in legislation. The ministry would have to say a learning disabilities class now is no longer limited at this number, it's higher, right? They'd have to change all of those, so those won't change. Do we add, is there a certain number of status quo in elementary?
The ratio?
Yeah.
Yes.
So we've added some elementary certs because we have a ratio there of certs to kids. I think it's 262. I'm looking at Sean. Is that right? 269. So we can go back and look, but we've kept that ratio of one cert per number of kids. So because we've grown in elementary a bit, we've grown the number of certs there as well. Does that help answer the number of our secondary ratio?
So next year, it will be 24.85 to 1.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If I can just step in and say that I'm sure I would hope everybody here understands what that means in terms of that is total staff divided by total students. So when you have a CERT or you have a librarian or we have a, that those change those numbers. So, I think a lot in the media, a lot of people think, well, what's 24 students? It's no big deal, but it's never that size, right? It's definitely going to be over 30, and and it's certainly in high school and certainly in the older grades, grade 7, grade 8. Those are big people in a small space that is not very accommodating for them. And many schools don't have air conditioning. We've had a good spring in that. From a teacher perspective, it's been a good spring because it hasn't been too hot. But the heat and the how hot it is in some classrooms without air conditioning, without good air circulation, it's just going to be further exacerbated by the fact that you're now going to have 30, most of the 8th grade students in my class are at least my size, and you're going to have 40 adults in a room. In high schools, I imagine it's even worse. So.
Any other comments, questions? No? So once again, I hope you can, I know it doesn't feel like good news almost anywhere. I totally appreciate that. Maybe I've been living with this too long. We've been working on this for a long time. But once again, I hope you, if you can appreciate how much we've tried to keep this away from spec ed. That is a percentage of the total 22 million in reduction. The fact that spec ed is only 500,000 or 447 is really, I think a testament to the value that's been put on meeting the needs of our kids. So, okay. So if there's no other comments, questions, then I've certainly heard your concerns and commentary. I know that our trustees here have as well. And tomorrow, this budget, it's already been presented publicly at the Committee of the Whole last Wednesday. That's not the unofficial board meeting, though. So the board meeting is tomorrow night when the trustees receive this. And then 2 weeks later is when it comes forward for a vote. So my commitment to you when we were debating, remember our last lengthy discussion about do we have another meeting or not? And at the end of it, we said, Mark, can't you just tell us if the budget passes or not and what it looks like? So my commitment to you is after the board meeting on the 19th. I'll let you know if it passes as is or if there are changes that happen before it is actually approved. And then that leads into our next item then, which is the spec ed plan, because it's tied to that process as well. So if we're done with budget, I'll go on to the spec ed plan, which I hope is brief, if people are okay with that. So it should be right here. So this is the document that was shared with you as well in the agenda package. And I'm going to make it a little bit larger for you. I'm going to go right to the very end, which I think Lorna mentioned to you in the email. So this document is the same as what you saw back in March. You recall that we brought the first draft of the spec ed plan to you in March. It has not changed except for crazy here, except for a few areas. And they're all areas that you've already heard about. So here I am in Appendix R. So I've shared with you over the last few months, some of these changes. So for example, so just so you understand, the intention is the spec ed plan needs to reflect any changes that we've made in the last few months, plus needs to reflect the changes that are in the proposed budget, right? Because we always want the spec ed plan to tell our families what's available in special education in Halton, right? So that's what you see here. So in the proposed budget is the discontinuation of the props class, so that's listed here. The primary language class, you remember I brought you the change where we have discontinued the PLC, at least as a title, and we've brought in the Alpha and the Kelp classes. So that change is reflected here as well. Because we've redesigned the role of the, sorry, I'm back up here, of the instructional program leader. Remember I told you we got rid of the IRT role and have designed a new role here for IPLs. So we've changed the language here in the standard 3 about that. Our managers of special services, we've added that they also supervise or have responsibilities around the Kelp and the Alpha classes, and remove the PLCs. Same again in standard 4, we changed the language around PLCs, Kelp, and Alpha. Going down further, standard 6, we've added some language again around Kelp and Alpha. Standard 9, we've changed, again, it's around PLCs, Kelp, and props. So once again, these I'm not sharing with you anything that you haven't heard from me before. It's just making sure that's included in the plan. In standard 12, we have deleted the IRTs from the multidisciplinary teams. Once again, that role doesn't exist anymore there. The staffing chart, and this is done every time, in standard 12, there's a chart that outlines all of the staff in each, how many are in each role. So that number, if when the budget passes, those numbers would be updated. So for example, where there are currently 49 child youth counselors, if the budget passes, that number will be 47, right? So Lorna does that. She updates that chart once the budget passes to make sure it reflects accurately the numbers of staff. Standard 17, we update the SEAC list because some of you are new. And in the appendices, no changes there. Everything that's in black, those are all the changes that were shared with you back in March. So what's new are just the changes in red. Any questions? If you have questions about the specific detail of what was that language, what was said, we just scroll back up and you can see exactly how we changed those things in the whole doc. So if there are no questions, I think we do need a motion to approve the SPED plan as it has been revised here, because that's what trustees need to hear on June 19th. So any questions before we do that? None? Okay, I'll look to Danielle if you want to ask for a motion.
Motion for the spec ed plan to be
Approved as is.
Lucille, second. Melissa,
Any discussion?
Diane?
Could I have a vote, pardon me, could I have a recorded vote, please? When we vote yes or no, could I have that recorded, please?
So she actually wants a show of hands to show all the yeses.
Okay.
And anyone that is a no vote to be recorded. So we're ready to vote.
So all those in favor?
I think, Diane, you've done this every year, haven't you? You've done this every year in the past, right? Just have a recorded vote of. So those in favor, is it?
Sorry, those in favor?
Yeah, put your hand up so Lorna can see. So everyone except the two Dianes, is that right? Okay, And those not in favor?
Those opposed? Diane and Diane.
I don't think anyone abstained, so it's,
Mike, Lisa, and they all opposed.
yeah. So the two Dianes voted no, everyone else voted yes. Did I get that right? Joanna and Danielle, was that? Yeah. Okay. So thank you for that. So that's a special education plan. So that will go to trustees on the 19th with those changes. Because at that board meeting, they approve the budget, and then because the budget is approved as it stands, if it is, then they approve the special education plan and the operational plan for the board for the next year.
Okay. We're on to 4.0.
Learning Disabilities Association of Halton has not supported the special ed plan for numerous years and for basically the same reasons. There is not a continuance of service from kindergarten to grade 12 for students with learning disabilities. And there isn't what we consider an appropriate assessment for students with learning disabilities at an early age.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Diane. I read your objections in the minority report, and I've heard some of the same concerns, which is about the intervention and how quickly that sometimes happens. So that is a concern of mine, and that's why I was voting against. And also I had heard some concerns as well about potential reassessments happening prior to going into high school, and that doesn't always seem to happen. So sometimes the programming that somebody maybe is put into isn't the correct programming. So those were my concerns and why I voted no.
Thank you, Diane. We'll move on to section 3.0 on the agenda, SEAC discussion question period. I don't know if there are any other questions or concerns. Lisa?
I just wanted to follow up with the assistive technology course. I've been in touch with a few CERTs, and they don't know anything about it. So I just want to make sure that it's moving forward.
Can you say specifically which course or program you're talking about?
The assistive technology course that runs during the summer.
I guess what we've called in the past are AT camps. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, thank you.
Sean, we are moving ahead with those. Yeah, do you want to come up and give a little detail? I know how much you love the mic. Okay.
Hi, thanks for that question. Yes, we are moving forward with that. LearnStyle will be offering the programs the schools have been set and contacted. The delay was ensuring that the company providing the programs were available and could staff it. I believe the message went out to CERTs yesterday, and if not, it will be this week. So if the CERTs haven't heard yet, they will this week. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Discussion? Okay, thank you. Move on to 4.0 communications, 4.1 superintendent's report.
So, in keeping with our intent of trying not to reiterate what's in our reports, I'm not going to, I think there's nothing there that I need to expand upon. The only part I was going to expand upon was the spec ed review, but we did talk about how that will be, a prime agenda item for us in September. And those of you that haven't had the chance to comb through it in the detail that Melissa has, because there's a lot there in those links. If you can have a chance to do that for our September meeting, that would be great. We'll have a presentation in September and discussion.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Oh,
Homework.
yeah. On to the 4.2 association reports. Diane?
Yeah, we submitted a report, so Lorna will have them in the agenda, but I just wanted to point out that I do have some flyers for the mental health training that we are offering in August 22nd, 23rd, 2 days, or September 21st and September 28th. This mental health training is for any adult who is interested, and you will leave knowing how to help and to recognize youth and young adults who are in distress. And it will be offered at our resource center just down the street. Pardon? Yes, you may have one of those flyers.
Thank you, Diane. Any other association reports to submit? Just wanted to make a point as well that although we've asked you to send in your association reports prior to the meeting that we can get them out to everybody, it certainly wasn't meant that you couldn't speak to them. If you had other information you wanted to add, bring up anything new, or even point out something special on that report that you sent in. So it wasn't meant to, you can't speak ever. It was just give everybody a good read before so that they know what you're going to speak about, but you can certainly add to it, etc. So, thank you. And the trustee report 4.3, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, so they had to be in by last Thursday, and some of the information wasn't made public until the Friday. So something that kind of comes into the spec ed arena is the boundary review for ERA 102 has been finalized, and the director has put a motion on the floor to expand the boundary of Ryerson, Frontenac, and Tecumseh, and shrink the John T. Tuck boundary. What they're basically doing is using New Street as a hard boundary line so that families that live north of New Street will go to north of New Street schools, and the children that live south of New Street will go to the south of New Street school, which is John T. Tuck. This does impact spec ed programming because the self-contained gifted class will still remain at Ryerson, and Tecumseh will also still accommodate some self-contained spec ed classes. But they will have an increased population as well. So that was it.
Thank you, Margot. Mark?
Sorry, I missed something I don't have in my report, but I really wanted to mention because, and we've just found out about this today. I want to say, Sean, is that right? We just found out today. One of our teachers, her name's Christine Warish. She has been recognized by the Ontario Council for Exceptional Children. She's been selected as the 2019 Teacher of the Year. She is, I'll make sure I get this right. Christine is she one of our life skills teachers, Sean? Thanks. At which school? At Sam Sherrod. She's the life skills teacher at Sam Sherrod. And, she does many wonderful things. One of the things she's been highlighted for, sort of really recognized for, is her students being involved in the Special Olympics torch run and other leadership sports activities such as our multi-sport day that she was involved with organizing this year. She also brought her class to the board office to meet with the director and participate in a music performance, as well as there's a number of things she's been recognized for here, but I won't list all of them. But quite an honor for her and for us as a board. We like to ride on others' coattails as much as we can, but her being recognized as Teacher of the Year is really wonderful. So it's Christine Warish, life skills teacher at Sam Sherritt. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mark. 4.3, the trustees report. That was you already. Okay. And on to 4.4, committees and interested representatives, the PIC. Accessibility Coordinating Committee.
We are actually meeting tomorrow morning, so I don't have an update at this point. There was an admin procedure on one of the accessibility admin procedures that's going into the board package for tomorrow's consideration. So Mark, I don't know, do we want to make that available? It's about customer service, I believe.
Yeah. That admin procedure, the government requires all school boards to have a policy. You know, as a board, we create admin procedures about customer service, and it's really about trying to ensure that as a service organization, we are making our services as accessible as possible. So that is about physical abilities as well as the mental capacity that people bring to us, as you know, in terms of us serving them. That in all ways we try to make sure we're as accessible as possible. We already do that. Well, we continue to do that in terms of our physical spaces, but this is about how we serve people as well. So I believe it's been updated to reflect some of our ongoing work that we do.
That's right. It's called Accessibility Standards for Customer Service, and the admin procedure is attached in the board agenda package for tomorrow's board meeting, so you can find it there. And if anybody wants a copy, please let Lorna know and we can share that with you.
Thank you. Equity and Inclusive Education Advisory Steering Committee. Diane?
Yeah. A small group was available to meet this past week, and we did a lot of work, and now I'm blanking. So I will send a report to Lorna tomorrow to include with the minutes.
Thank you so much, Diane.
It's the time.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Nelson Robert Bateman HS integration update. Margot?
So I was actually in Nelson earlier this week. The principal has said they have started to bring some bins into the back to get rid of some of their, I'll say, junk that doesn't need to be there. They are looking at, on the 28th of June, which is the last day of school, all the office staff from Nelson are leaving and going to Bateman for the summer, so that the school will be empty and ready for any of the more intensive work that has to be done to be ready to open in September. So that's where we stand. Also, I don't know if it fits into, Diane, your equity and inclusive education report, but Joanne and I are both on the Human Rights Symposium planning group. That is happening in December of this year, and they are focusing on the United Nations rights of the child. So stay tuned for that too. Did you talk about that? No, okay.
Great, thank you, Margot. That brings us to 5.0, next agenda and order paper.
So I guess I've already suggested that the spec ed review be the bulk of our next meeting. Is there any other? I typically include some sort of system startup information in my report, just to help you know if there's anything that's happened that's sort of note as we've started up for the year. but I would suggest that there's lots in the review for us to chew on, and that we could focus most of the agenda on that in September, if that's okay with everyone.
Can I ask for something to, so I know that Melissa was talking about the idea of busing all these children to the different places. I was wondering if we could maybe get a map, sort of like a map idea of where the self-contained classrooms are within the Halton region? At the next meeting, could we maybe look at something like that?
So this phase of the spec ed review has focused on learning disabilities and gifted.
Right, no, I'm just
So-
talking in general. So in general, across Halton, there are self-contained classrooms in different schools.
Correct.
So is there a way that we can have an idea of where
We
the
could,
self-contained classrooms are?
right. So we could certainly do that. So I guess my question is, because the review focuses on those two exceptionalities, but you'd like a map of where all classes are.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I think so.
We could do that. Yes, thank you. So we typically, as you know, meet on the first Tuesday of each month. We don't do that though in the first week of September, because that's the first day of school. So in September, it's not the first Tuesday, which I think is the third, thank you. So instead, it's the second Tuesday in September, which is the 10th. So unless for some reason we decide we want to be on a different night of the week, we've talked about this before and it was a big uproar, so well, I know you as organizations have your meetings kind of set around this and the Catholic board meetings and other things, so I'm not trying to stir the pot. So we'll keep it on the Tuesday.
Diane?
I just had a question or a point I wanted to raise, and I know we're not going into the special education review and the summary until the fall, but so I don't know when to make this point or if now is an okay time. One of the things I read in there, and since we aren't meeting till after the start of school, is one of the things in the results of the Tell Them From Me survey was the fact that there was a positive sense of belonging, intellectual engagement, but the third point was anxiety. And that just struck me that if there's that positive sense of belonging, intellectual engagement, what is the source of the anxiety then? And so one of the things, just because we are increasing class sizes because of the changes, there are programs that are going to be changed and a whole continuum of students in these classes, especially larger classes and changes with teachers, just to bear that in mind, that there is that anxiety issue that is coming back. And I know there's all sorts of changes, but I just wanted to focus in on that. That really jumped out at me, and to what's the source then of that anxiety.
Great.
Thank you, Diane.
Great question. And something like this review answers some questions, but prompts many others, which I think a good process like this does. So thanks for that. Maybe I'll just add that this is a time of year where staff are doing lots of transition planning, right? And the ministry's direction to school boards, which is I agree with very much, is that transitions look very different for many kids. For some, it's the transition from one year to the next. That's a bit of what we're talking about now. For some, it's the transition from one room to another during the school day, or from morning to afternoon, or to all those kinds of things. So the transition needs of our kids are always a focus for us, and we're planning for those, and that those plans should be built into the IPs. But for sure, at this time of year, we're doing transition planning for September. So what should that September startup look like for our students? And, so we're developing those. Sorry. And so it is an area of focus, trying to make those transitions as smooth as possible and reduce that anxiety.
Deirdre?
Well, I also wanted to ask if there is some of the questions that were given out in terms of the study that was done, so we can see exactly what was asked of the participants because we get a generalized summary and they interpret the data. Is it possible to see what was asked and how it was asked, whether or not it was open-ended or closed-ended, or how they asked the questions and what they were? And my second item, because I know it's probably going to come up, because Melissa's brought it up regarding, of course, self-contained gifted in primary. Do we have some numbers on what transportation is and what the costs are in terms of these classrooms? We do know that we're part of, there's no spec ed that's kind of pushed aside for us in particular, that our learners are part of the whole population as students. So I'm just interested in what that major difference is, even though our population is, and where those numbers fall in line. What are the ages where these costs are being incurred before we get, talking about what that means on an overall scale to everybody?
We'll add this to our list of requests. Sorry, I have a little tickle in my throat. We've talked about the transportation costs for a number of programs, all programs, at different times during the review. We actually tried to really tease that out in the first phase and a little bit in the second phase, and it was very difficult to do because our kids with special needs, in more cases than not, ride the bus with all their other kids. So it was hard to be able to tease out specifically to say, here's the transportation cost for that exceptionality, even for that one student when they're riding with another 50 students, for example. So I'll have to go back into the work. We ended up not sharing the costing work that we were doing because we knew it wasn't fulsome enough. We knew that, for us to rely on that costing work, it wasn't valid enough, I guess, if you could say, because we don't gather the data that we were looking for. Doesn't mean it's not out there. We just don't gather it. So in that phase of the review, it was just not possible to cost things. So, but we have done some. So we did do some work. So we'll go back and dig into that and see if we were able to tease that out. I know there's a cost. I just couldn't tell you how much.
I think the concern is just like Melissa had pointed out earlier, not that we're grabbing at scraps, but we, of course, want to represent all children equally. And so I don't, if this study comes to show that there's maybe points in there regarding our contained classes for identified gifted, that we know exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the costs before we start compromising the care.
Sure. So just to clarify the requests, so one around costing of transportation if we can for self-contained gifted, a map of our of all self-contained classes in the board, and wasn't there one more request? Oh, thank you. And so the questions that were asked of the participants. So we could pull out the parent surveys because we had a really good response. I think we sent out to 10,000 parents. We had quite a high response rate, so we can do that. And then we also had a number of focus groups with staff and parents, so we can pull out all those questions as well. Sure. Anything else for the next meeting?
Meeting adjourned. Meeting adjourned. Have a good summer.